So as our text here, and where we're going to come back to and kind of finish, is Genesis 32. Let's read verses 26 through 28, and then we'll kind of back up to chapter 28 to see the trajectory, the direction. So Genesis 32, verse 26 says, "And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed." And the part that I want to focus on here is, hey, I'm not going to let you go, except thou bless me, except thou bless me. But if we were to back up to Genesis 28, in Genesis 28, this is right on the heels of what has happened with Jacob and Esau. In verse 36 of chapter 27, Esau says, Is not he rightly named Jacob? For he hath supplanted me these 2 times. He took away my birthright. Behold, now he hath taken away my blessing. And he said, Hast thou not reserved a blessing for me? He's speaking to Isaac. And Isaac does give him a blessing of a sort. But when we get to chapter 28, Jacob is fleeing from Esau. Because of what he's done, because of the way that he and his mother have treated his brother, he has to run from his house. And verse 45, until thy brother's anger turn away from thee. Sorry, this is in chapter 27. And he forget that which thou hast done to him, then I will send and fetch thee from thence. Why should I be deprived also of you both in one day? And so here's this sense where Rebekah sends him away. She sends him off to back to where her family is from. And it's on his way here that God speaks to Jacob. If we look in chapter 28 now, verse 12, we could look in verse 17 as well, we see the picture of Jacob's ladder. And this is a story that we think of. We won't spend a ton of time here. In verse 12 it says, And he dreamed, and behold, a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God ascending and descending on it. Chapter 28, verse 17. So he speaks, there's this statement from God, I'm with thee, I will keep thee in the places whither thou goest. In verse 17, Jacob, he wakes up, says, And he was afraid and said, How dreadful is this place? This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. And we aren't going to come back to this at the end of the message like we have, but this is one way, this is one place where Christ is pictured particularly in this section of the history of Jacob's life. He's foreshadowed. Where we read in verse 12, Behold the angels of God ascending and descending on it. Well, John chapter 1, verse 51 says, Ye shall see, Jesus speaking here of himself, the angels of God ascending and descending. And is this on a ladder? No, he says, upon the Son of Man. He says, so you're going to see the angels ascending and descending, like Jacob saw the angels ascending and descending, but instead of on a ladder, it's upon me. Verse 17 of Genesis 28, where Jacob says, How dreadful is this place? This is none other but the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. Well, John chapter 2 and verse 19, Jesus said, Destroy this temple, and I think we could understand that as this house of God. In 3 days, I will raise it up. Verse 21 of that passage, he spake of the temple of his body, the dwelling place of God of his body. So here Christ is saying, look, I'm the house of God. I'm the dwelling place of God. John chapter 10, where, again, Jacob, he says, this is the gate of heaven. Here's this connection point between heaven and earth. And John chapter 10, verse 9, Jesus says, I am the door. By me, if any man enter in, he shall be saved. And so here's this picturing of Christ as where there's connection to eternal life. Christ is where there's connection to heaven. Christ is where heaven and earth meet. Rather than this ladder, rather than this place, Christ says, look, I am the connection between heaven and earth. If we look in Genesis 28, verse 13, we see that God has a plan for his life. The Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac. The land whereon thou liest, to thee will I give it, and to thy seed. And so here God is presenting that he has this plan for him. And Jacob kind of offers back a conditional covenant to God. In verse 20 of Genesis 28, Jacob vowed a vow and said, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and raiment to put on, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then shall the Lord be my God. Jacob gives this very conditional, it's heavily conditioned promise or covenant to God. He says, look, I'll choose God, I'll latch on to God, I'll hold on to God if God takes care of me. If God brings me back here to my father's house safely. I want to go back home. And if I can get back home safe, taken care of, fed, clothed, all the good stuff, then, God can be my God then. And the stone which I have set for a pillar shall be God's house, and of all that thou shalt give me, I will surely give the 10th unto thee. So God, then I'll give this place back to you. Say this is going to be mine, I'll give it back to you. Then it can be your house. And then whatever you give me, I'll give a 10th to you. Very conditional. But then in chapter 29, we're reminded again of the failure that it is when we don't follow God's plan. Just at the end of the chapter, this passage here, it talks about what Jacob does, how he goes and he labors for Laban, how he meets Rachel. But we won't spend a lot of time there just for the sake of time, but I'm sure you guys know that story. But here's, again, an example of Jacob going. He's in a place where really he ought not to be in the first place. He should be with his father. He should be in the promised land. But instead, he's been sent to this other place. And of course, he runs into trouble. He runs into difficulty. He loves Rachel. And there's deceit. The way he is a deceiver, he's been deceived. And Laban tricks him. But we come down to verse 31. Here's where we see, hey, this happens, there's this problem, and what happens? What's the result? Chapter 29, verse 31. And when the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. And we won't read all this. She has several sons here and names them, the end of verse 35, and left off bearing. She has Judah, who left off bearing. She has here Reuben, she has Simeon, Levi, and Judah. Okay? Verse 1 of chapter 30, and Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children. Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel. And he said, am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? And so here, there's this conflict that arises because God puts his blessing on Leah. He doesn't. It's very clear that God's blessing is on Leah throughout this, and it is not on Rachel through this section, if you read through this. And Rachel then has this demand for a child. And we're going to see that there's a sense that she's probably been asking God for a child. Like that's probably happening. But she doesn't have the right spirit about it. She doesn't have the right attitude about it. There's not this following of what God's plan is. Right here, he has 2 wives. Is polygamy, having multiple wives, multiple partners, is that God's plan? No, it always in the Bible goes hand in hand with trouble. It just does. Every case you see multiple wives, there's problems. There's trouble. When Solomon takes all these wives, he says, hey, this is what I deserve. Why shouldn't I have this? Why can't I have them? Look how smart I am, how rich I am, how famous I am. Problems, difficulty, trouble. And here, this even having the 2 wives, it's against the good order that God establishes from the beginning, what he ordained at the beginning in Genesis 2. We just read the verses there where Rachel is barren. But what we're going to see is another man-made solution. Remember what happened with Abraham and Sarah? It's a man-made solution. Verse 3, and she said, Rachel, behold my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knees, and I may also have children by her. And so she gives her maid. What we're seeing here is this family pattern that's been established from Abraham. This should be something that strikes us, and we should think, man, what pattern am I setting for my kids? Now, our kids are their own free agents, right? They have choices to make. But at the same time, we want to do our best to set a proper pattern for them as best as we possibly can. Let's see, we read verse 3. Let's read verse 4. And she gave unto him Bilhah, her handmaid, to wife, and Jacob went in unto her, and Bilhah conceived, and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore called she his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. Dan means judging. So here's the sense that she feels like she has been judged by God, she's been considered by God, and God has now given her the thing that she wants. Naphtali, she talks about the fact, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister. So she calls her son here wrestling, her surrogate son. And she says, and I have prevailed. So she says, hey, I've prevailed against my sister in this. Now I want you to think for a second, how was Rachel's handmaid having two sons in her name any sort of a victory over Leah? How is that a victory? Leah had 4 sons. She had the firstborn. She had Levi, the patriarch of the priests. She had Judah as well in there, Simeon and Judah. Judah is the tribe that becomes the Jewish nation, the southern kingdom that stays more honorable, stays more faithful to God. How is it that Rachel's 2 surrogate children from a servant girl are prevailing over Leah? It's not. You guys are out here shaking your heads. It's not. She's self-deceiving. She's a fool here. When we use our own human and wicked imaginations to prevail, it's a hollow victory. She said that she had prevailed in her wrestling with Leah, but she hadn't won at all. There was no victory there. And you can see bitterness then between the sisters. Verse 14, 14 to 15. And Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them unto his mother, Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, give me, I pray thee, of thy son's mandrakes. And she said unto her, is it a small matter that thou hast taken my husband? And wouldest thou take away my son's mandrakes also? And I want to pause there. You might say, boy, this is an outsized reaction. Oh, and I've heard people describe, Rachel was being like demanding of her. Maybe. But I think more, this just demonstrates how ruined their relationship was. How bitter they were towards each other now. That Leah just has some stuff that came in from the field that her son brought. And Rachel says, hey, can I have some of those? And she says, you want my husband first, and now you want the fruit out of the field as well? She snaps back at her because of the anger and bitterness that's built up in her. And we can read on at the end of verse 15. Rachel said, therefore he shall lie with thee tonight for thy son's mandrakes. She sells her husband off for mandrakes. Verse 16, the note that I put here is a very healthy and joyful marriage. If you guys have known me at all, you might read that this is sarcasm. Verse 16, Jacob came out of the field in the evening, and Leah went out to meet him and said, thou must come in unto me, for surely I have hired thee with thy son's mandrakes. And he lay with her that night. Hey, you have to come with me because I bought you tonight. Oh, what a joyous, happy marriage. Verses 17 through 20, Leah has 2 more sons and a daughter. So who's the blessed one? Rachel then, in verses 22 through 24, is granted a son of her own after crying to God for years. And God, verse 22, and God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her and opened her womb. So she has been speaking to God about this. Now, I think there's problems with her view, and we're going to see that in the coming chapters. But God grants it to her. God has mercy on her. Let's look in chapter 31. Of course, there's this time where Jacob has labored on behalf of Laban to purchase the two sisters. But there's bitterness in more of the family than just the two sisters. If we look in verses 6 and 7 of chapter 31. It says, "And ye know that with all my power," this is Jacob speaking, "I have served your father." So he's saying, look, I did everything for him. I worked so hard. "And your father hath deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God suffered him not to hurt me." So now we're seeing, man, Jacob's bitter at Laban as well. Now imagine for a moment if Jacob had followed the model of his father, okay, Abraham and Isaac. Let's just imagine for a moment. If Jacob hadn't chosen to trip up the purpose, the plan, the path that God had for him, and he was still in the promised land. And if Isaac, like Abraham did, had sent a servant, a messenger, to go find a wife for him, imagine the things that would not have happened. You know, if he had stayed in the promised land, he had sent his servant to bring Rachel back to him. Well, there wouldn't be the same issue of confusion between Rachel and Leah. You know, there wouldn't be an issue between the two of them. Any deceit from Laban would have become very obvious on a journey to come back and bring her back to meet Jacob. Right? If the servant went and it was the will of God that Rachel be the wife of Jacob, there would be no problem. Even if Laban tried to sneak in the other sister, well, if it's like let's say it's just a 2-day trip. You know, there's sunshine in 2 days, right? You can see them. Okay, you can see, oh, this is the wrong one. No. We got the wrong one. The one that we feel like God has chosen here is Rachel. Okay? There wouldn't have been this mix-up. We're going to see this in a moment, but Jacob's wife would have come out of the idolatrous house of Laban, and she would have been surrounded by a family that worshiped the true God. Now, that's not to say that Abraham and Isaac were perfect, okay, but we're going to see that Laban worships false gods. He has idols in his house. And so instead of Jacob going into that environment, going into that household and living there with the idols, instead his wife would have come to the promised land. There would have been no working, you know, these years and years laboring for Leah or for Rachel, creating this broken relationship now that he has with his father-in-law. And all of that happened because Jacob wouldn't wait on God. He had to run for his life from his own brother because of his sinful decisions wrestling with God's plan. But we could see in verse 8 here that God, is it verse 8? Verse 9, excuse me. Verse 9, and then of course there's this whole section, but God still accomplishes his unique will. He has a purpose to bless Jacob. He has said he's going to do that. He had already promised that. So he still accomplishes it in verse 9. "Thus God hath taken away the cattle of your father and given them to me." And you can look into it and read the story more. But God, even in this place where Jacob really shouldn't be in the first place, God still says, look, I still have a plan. I still have a purpose. I have promised this, so I'm going to fulfill it. So he gives blessing to Jacob. You can see in verses 14 and 15 that Rachel and Leah also are bitter and angry at their father. Verse 14, "Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there yet any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house?" So this is where Jacob now is considering, hey, maybe we should leave. And they say, well, there's nothing left for us here anyhow. That's the substance of what's being said here. It's stated in a question. Verse 15, "Are we not counted of him strangers? For he hath sold us." So they're remembering the fact that that Laban made Jacob work for them, pay them off. That he wouldn't let them be married until he had provided sufficient monetary value to Laban. He sold us and hath quite devoured also our money. Everything's used up. He's got nothing left. He has no inheritance. These are all more consequences of Jacob's choices early in life. In chapter 31, then, Jacob, he leaves Laban's house abruptly and secretly. There's a level of the kind of summary and detail structure again, as we see so often in Genesis, is normal here. Verse 3 tells us that God told Jacob to return to the land of the fathers, but verses 11 through 13 gives the specific details of God speaking to him. And what we can see, I think, is how Jacob is more and more in his life coming closer to God. You see this progression start to happen. He has wrestled. He refused to wait on God as a young man. He promised that he would serve the Lord as long as God took care of him. He took, 2 wives rather than honoring his first marriage. He continues to give more honor to Rachel, though God demonstrates that his blessing, his abundance is on Leah. But he is now listening to God. When God says, I want you to go, he's going. The reason he's returning to Canaan is because he listened to the word of God. Return to the land of thy fathers, in verse 3, and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee. In verses 5, 7, 9, all the way in verse 42 as well, when speaking to Laban, he credits God with providing for him. And then at the end of chapter 31, we see that he offers a sacrifice to God as he and Laban are parting ways finally. And there's an awareness that the true God, the God of Abraham, is the one that's going to hold them to the covenant that they bind. They basically come to a mutual parting of ways. And they say, look, let's settle this. And he acknowledges that God is going to hold him to it. And yet, and I didn't put the verse in here. Let's see. I know I looked at it several times. Let's see if I could find... It is in verse 19. So in verse 17, Jacob arose and set his sons and his wives upon camels. So they go to leave, verse 19, and Laban went to shear his sheep. So they sneak away when Laban's out working. And Rachel had stolen the images that were her father's. And we can see Laban comes to confront him. Again, more problems because of sin, because he's where he shouldn't be. But he approaches Jacob, and Jacob says, look, I did not steal your stupid idols. Okay? He says, you can go search through everything. And whoever has it, if you find it, let's see, I think it is. Before our brethren discern thou what is thine with me, and take it to thee. And the phrase before, let him not live. Okay, so if you find that somebody in my caravan has stolen from you, you can kill him. And then you can take whatever you think is yours back with you. So this is not Jacob's doing. Jacob has no idea. It says that he did not know that Rachel stole him. Verse 32. The end of verse 32, for Jacob knew not that Rachel had stolen them. And it says, Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the 2 maidservants' tent, and he found them not. Then went he out of Leah's tent and entered into Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the images and put them in the camel's furniture and sat upon them. And of course she gives excuse why she can't get up. I'm sure you guys know that. But here's Rachel, Jacob's beloved wife, the apple of his eye. That he loves more than his first wife. And Rachel wants to bring the idols that her family has always worshipped along with her. Rachel, she wants to have God's blessing in childbearing, but she still clings to, she's still not letting go of her false gods. She's still hanging on to those. And really, this is the end of Rachel's story. When Jacob and Esau, when they meet up as Jacob is returning, yes, it mentions Leah and Rachel by name, but there's no more active part in the story. Rachel deceives. She lies, and she smuggles out the false gods, and then a few chapters later, she dies in sorrow. Her life ends in sadness. She literally tries to name her second son Ben-Oni, right? Ben meaning son of sorrow. That's the name she tries to saddle him with. And Jacob says, no, 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 Benjamin, son of my right hand, Ben Yamin. And we won't dig into every moment of these chapters, but I mean, we could spend time looking at, really, there's a beautiful story when Jacob and Esau come back together as brothers. And Jacob describes that he sees in Esau's face the face of God shining out. We could look at the account of Dinah and Shechem, where Shechem sleeps with Dinah before their marriage covenant and then tries to make her his wife. The Hivites, they use this as a plan. Shechem seems somewhat innocent in this, to be honest. He's not innocent in his sin. He still sins, right? He sleeps with Dinah before marriage. But he's like, Dad, can we get her as my wife? And I'm talking way more about this story than I intended to, but his dad begins to plot. He's like, ooh, we can get them to come in and mingle with us. So yeah, we'll lure them in, and they'll join with us. We'll absorb them as a people. And Dinah's brothers, Levi and Simeon, well, they come up with a plan. I don't know if you guys remember it, but they say, oh, well, if we're gonna, be associated with you guys have to be circumcised like we're all supposed to be circumcised. And they do it. And then Levi and Simeon kill them all. They just go in and kill them all. And the reason why is they say in chapter 34, verse 31, hey, should he be able to treat our sister like a harlot? When Jacob's kind of reprimanding them. We can look at the descendants of Esau, the Edomites, in chapter 36. But I want to spend a few minutes, as we're concluding here, in the story of Jacob's final wrestling. So chapter 32, where we already read, starting in verse 24. We'll read verse 24 down to verse 31, and we'll talk about this section. Verse 24 says, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against the man, I'm going to say the man, just to clarify the characters here. The man touched the hollow of Jacob's thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint as he wrestled with the man. And the man said, let me go, for the day breaketh. And Jacob said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And the man said unto him, what is thy name? And Jacob said, Jacob. And the man said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked the man and said, tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And the man said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And the man blessed Jacob there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. He limped on that leg. Now, as we talk about this wrestling, I want to remember very quickly what Jacob's name is. He's the one who grabs the heel. He snatches at the heel. He's the one who supplants, who gets underfoot. He trips, causes to stumble. He's always battled. He's always wrestling with God's will, how it should happen and when it should happen. And God wants to use Jacob. God has already said, I'm going to use him. I have a purpose and a plan for his life. God has declared his plans over and over for what he intends to do with Jacob. Now, we won't take time to look at references to try to prove who this mysterious man is. But verse 30, it says, Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. Now, people will argue about this verse even, but it seems very clear that in some way, this man is God. Okay? And we can talk about that more in Sunday school, Bible study during Sunday school time in the future here. But in verses 24 through 25, here, the man who is God, he wrestles with Jacob, the wrestler, the foot tripper. And he, God, is not having his way. He hasn't prevailed over Jacob's life. And so what does the man do? He breaks Jacob's joint. He literally damages Jacob beyond repair. Now, in wrestling or jiu-jitsu or MMA, once in a great while, a joint will get dislocated or a bone will get broken. It's not common, but it does happen. And what happens, and what every time, the match is immediately over. It is over. It is ruled over, and it is done. The pain is debilitating. Usually, if there's a break, both contestants are like, they're like, oh no, that was terrible. And they stop. The pain's debilitating. There could only be more damage, and the person's ability to continue wrestling is reduced to almost nothing. So here in this story, the match is over between Jacob and our mysterious God-man figure. He's disabled. His leg is out of joint. It's pulled out completely. And the man then tells Jacob, hey, time is up. The day is breaking. And what's Jacob's response? No, I desire your blessing. I won't let go of you. Now think of the parallel, and I think these details matter. Think of what Rachel did when she left her father's house and what she refused to let go of. Where Rachel would not let go of idols, Jacob says he won't let go of God. I believe that Jacob here is recognizing, look, I've wrestled. I've done what seemed best to me. I have fought and I've battled, and I am not winning. I can't get my way. I maybe have lost everything by wrestling with you here, God. But you know what? I won't let go of you. You are where blessing comes from. Of course, the God-man here then asks, what is your name? And again, this is not a mistaken detail. Does the man know who Jacob is? Does he know his name? Yes. So he's bringing his name into the situation, into the story, for a particular reason. Jacob says, I'm the one who holds on to the heel. I'm the one who supplants. I trip everything and everyone up. And the man here, the God-man, he creates this contrast. He's pointing out that the new has a shift from the old. Thy name shall no more be Jacob, who trips the heel, but Israel. Now, Israel as a name can be viewed as having different meanings. The El at the end, Israel, is God, but the Israel is debated. People struggle with this and try to understand where it comes from. Some view it as meaning prevail or power. So either, God prevails, God has power, or having power with God. Others take it to mean to fight, to strive, to contend. So perhaps fighter for God, or maybe God fights on behalf of him, or one who fights or wrestles with God. And to be fair, I think either one would fit the picture of what's happening. But in my eyes, it strikes me that he has given power with God as the blessing in his new name. Because I think that's what is promised in the rest of this verse. When he tells him, as a prince, right, as a ruler, as a governor, as one who is over, hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. So here we have a man in Jacob who has spent his whole life wrestling with God. He's struggled and he's fought. He's gone through difficulty and hardship because of it. And he's come out damaged. In every one of his family relationships, in time wasted and lost, and now physically even. But his wrestling against God is over now. He's prevailed and he's given power and blessing. He's finally had his last wrestling match. And he walks away damaged but blessed. Now, does that mean that God wanted Jacob to fight him, to wrestle against him for the decades leading up to this? I think the obvious answer is no, but let me ask you a few more questions to illustrate this. Did God want him to usurp his brother's birthright by selling him soup that probably should have just been offered to him? Did God want him and Rebekah to lie to deceive Isaac for the fatherly blessing? Did God desire for Jacob to run from his brother, his father and his mother out of the promised land to join with a family of idol worshippers? What about his wives? Was it God's plan for Jacob to have a terrible home life, a family that demonstrated dysfunction and chaos to his children because of the two sisters that his choices had pitted against each other? What about his thigh? Was it God's perfect plan to destroy his thigh, giving him a halt, a limp for presumably the rest of his life? No. But, as we've seen over and over, God uses wrong things for good. Yes, it's an evil that shouldn't have been there, but he can still bring it about to a good purpose. And Jacob came through damaged, broken, and hurt, but he finally prevails, and he's blessed. There's a question, I'm going way too long, but there's a question that's always bothered me with this. I always thought, I'm like, wait, did Jacob actually beat the God-man in a wrestling match? And, on the ropes, as a last-ditch effort, he uses supernatural power to disable Jacob's thigh. How did he prevail? Did he physically beat him in this wrestling match so that he could receive a blessing? Is that how we interact with God? No, Jacob lost. He lost. It took in the picture of what this is picturing about his whole life, I believe, it took Jacob decades of time. He struggled and he fought, but eventually he was broken by his choices and his decision to fight against God. And when he was broken, he finally realized that he needed God and he clung to him, begging for his blessing. The day that Jacob decided to hold to God and ask for God's way, for God's blessing, rather than saying, how can I get a blessing for myself? That's the day that he finally is given blessing from God and a promise to prevail with men, having power as a prince. Now think back to what in Jacob's mind probably would have been a lifetime ago in his mind, to Genesis 28. Remember Jacob's covenant that he promised to God? Let me read it again. Genesis 28, verse 20. And Jacob vowed a vow, saying, if God will be with me, and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat, and raiment to put on. And then verse 21 says, then shall the Lord be my God. That's when I'll choose Jehovah as my God. But compare that in chapter 32 to verses 9 and 10, leading up to this wrestling match. And Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham, and God of my father Isaac, the Lord, or Yahweh, which said unto me, return unto thy country and to thy kindred, I will deal well with thee. He says that this Lord God who said that to me, he says, I am not worthy of the least of all the mercies and of all the truth which thou hast showed unto thy servant. And he goes on. And look at that. Look at the change in Jacob's attitude towards God. In one place he says, God, if you take care of me, then I'll choose you as my God. And in another, he realizes everything that God has already given to him. The blessings that God has provided. The grace and the mercy that's showered on him. And rather than saying, hey, keep it up, God, if you want me to choose you, he says, I don't deserve even the least of what you've done for me already. We can battle through our lives doing things our own way. And I think a lot of the time, actually, there's a certain pride. Even once we've kind of gotten through it, there's almost like a sense of pride about our wrestling. You might hear somebody say, oh, I came to God the hard way. He had to give me, a couple good smacks or something. I have a friend in New Mexico who'd say things like that. And really, I think that's a pride on our part. It's not a humble submission to the Creator, that we would laugh at our own stubbornness and how God had to break our thigh to cause us to stop running from him. And that was Jacob. He was going to make sure that God's will, as he understood it, was going to happen, no matter what he had to do to make it happen, no matter who he had to offend or hurt. And in reality, he was just tripping up his own life and hurting himself. And it wasn't until he was crushed and defeated and broken that he saw his need and recognized that God owed him nothing. And that was when he was blessed. And that was when he prevailed. Man, again, the parallel with Rachel. Rachel says, I wrestled with my sister and I prevailed. Here, Jacob, he wrestles with God and he prevails. But what's the difference? Rachel's prevailing was empty. It was false. And it was a pitiful mockery of what God was going to do in Jacob's life. What God was going to do for Jacob to cause him to prevail. Rachel had this sin, this sinful failure that she called prevailing by choosing her own way and forcing things to happen and claiming that was God working for her. Jacob wrestled, and Jacob won when, humanly speaking, he had lost. He prevailed only by clinging to the God of his fathers and looking for his blessing. I think if we can put it this way, the moral of the story here in the life of Jacob is that God can accomplish his will. God can bring it to pass. We don't have to make it happen on his behalf. It doesn't mean that we sit around and do nothing, but it definitely means that we don't smash down the door with lying and cheating and stealing, destroying our families, and then say, well, God's will for me sure was a rough road. God may later use those problems and that brokenness for a good purpose because he's good. But we should be saying, God, I give up. I surrender. I just want to cling to you, and I need your blessing. Do what you want with my life. And so I think the story, what this teaches us about God, is let's stop from wrestling and switch from wrestling to just humble surrender, holding on to God for his promise and his blessing.